Hello and welcome to the CFB SuperShow live before lock edition. We are just under 1 hour to main slate lock. College football week 2. We're out here coming off an absolute tremendous week 1 across the board for our community. We are looking to continue what we're calling our best season ever. We have done the work. We have done the studying. We feel great. I'm Walt Waddell, as you know, at WDeuce85 on all platforms. We're here on the FTN network. We're ready to make things happen. The way this will work, we'll kind of rehash some of the plays that I'm still on, talk about anything that's changed strategically speaking. I'll also go over some ownership projections and what it's looking like out there, maybe top 5 chalk at each spot, any other bets, props, PrizePicks stuff that I'm adding. And if you have questions, comments, concerns, please make sure you are throwing those out there, whether that's on the YouTube channel itself or over on X, where we're also broadcasting there. You guys can chat in either of those places and it will pop up and I'll see it. Good news is also we won't be doing the playback thing this week. FTN has a playback channel. We've talked about that in the past. I've given the powers that be the feedback that you guys wanted. We are going to be looking into that as early as next week. So hopefully this time next week after the show ends, we'll have a featured game where we pop on stream, watch the game, tilt it together, and hopefully get some live green screen sweats going on. Pretty intriguing slate on tap today. Last week had a little bit more excitement in terms of pure entertainment. This is a bit of a grittier slate, if you will, but there's a ton of fun games going on later. The FanDuel main slate, of course, has games throughout. The DraftKings night slate, in which my typical co-host Jake Kuchek will have an article released for that. That is approximately 9 games. And then we have the late night slate 5-gamer, which will be Discord coverage. That is typically one of the highest edge slates that we are a part of, simply because all day affair, people getting tired out by the time that late night slate happens. People aren't checking news. They're not changing their lineups. And if something happens, there's a big amount of edge involved. All right. This is a tough build today. There's going to be some overlap. Pricing errors are there. Maybe not as egregious as last week, but definitely still there. And we're going to be able to, do some jockeying with our lineups here, because there are a few spots that I do like, and I think that we're going to be able to utilize and be overweight compared to the rest of the field. They'll have to do the rest, of course, but at least we'll be in a position for leverage. And as I say, just naturally myself, I end up being a leverage player on each slate, and I don't do it on purpose. I don't set out to play a guy just because he won't be rostered. It just ends up working out that way because of the way that I play and build in contests. And there are a few players that we're going to talk about here this morning that follow into that category. Let's do a quick news dump here. The first thing is Andrew Armstrong of Arkansas. He is currently on the field warming up, or in the end zone area. Basically has cleats taped up, has his uniform on. There's a leg on his sleeve, or a sleeve on his leg. Doesn't have his pads and everything on, but game gear is there. Chance that your stud wide receiver for Arkansas, Andrew Armstrong, does play. And right off top, getting questions about that. Get off Tyrone Broden. Probably not the best play there on Broden if Armstrong does play, as he will take targets away. I still like Luke Haas. Luke is our kind of our super sneak play, right? The other Luke Lachey on the Iowa is going to be somewhat chalky. Haas coming back. He grew up about an hour away from Stillwater. He and his twin brother, who plays on the team as well. And he's very geared up, hyped up to play in front of friends and family, as you can imagine. But also Taylon Green being a mobile quarterback and his tendency to lean on the tight ends, I feel like Haas is primed for a great game at a sub 4K price point. So still like Haas. Broden, not as much. Even if Armstrong doesn't play, Broden, personally for me, is not a huge play, but he's definitely a solid option, right? Other relevant news, let's just double check. Didn't see anything for the main slate. There was a few things for later on, like receiver Kelly Akrahi for Mississippi State will likely be out for the Arizona State game late tonight. Let's Let's see. Burp, burp, burp. Jaden Ott is a game time decision for Cal. Not a huge play for us, anyways, because of the fact that he's so expensive. But if ever there was a time to play two expensive running backs, a la Ollie Gordon and Jaden Ott, you could definitely do it today because there is so much value in the receivers. There's not really a necessity to pay up for those spots. But yeah, Ott being a game time decision, something to monitor at least. All right. Skyline asks Giddens or LaQuint Allen. Right now, I would say probably Giddens, and that'll be a good segue into talking about rostership. Giddens is projected to be one of the highest owned running backs on the slate. So, if you're one of those people who's playing more single entry stuff and you want to be more in line with the rest of the industry, Giddens is your play there. I still love LaQuint Allen. I think he's a great overall option. But admittedly, I have sort of started to push my chips in on Jamal Haynes on the other side in that game of Georgia Tech, simply because digging in a little deeper, Syracuse, their defensive situation and as far as their rush defense didn't look great last week. They have a key injury on the defensive front there to one of their best inside, I believe their inside linebacker. That's not going to be good for the running game, and it just seems like Jamal Haynes is going to have a huge, huge day. So to answer your questions, Giddens or Allen, I would be on Giddens, but I still like LaQuint Allen. He's in my group of 5 running backs that I've been talking about on Discord this morning. FanDuel question from my man Craig: Ryan Williams and Taylon Green or Super Mario and Grayson McCall. I also have Jalen Milroe in already, so wanting to see about pairing up. Ryan Williams is our guy. He did well for us last week. That's a tough one, man. On FanDuel, I would say the move there would be Ryan Williams, Taylon Green. That's how I would play it. I still love Grayson McCall. I have all his props and everything. But I would lean that way with Williams and Green just to have that pairing where touchdowns are a little more important and that correlation makes much more sense. So for me, it'd be Green and Williams. But full disclosure, I obviously have a lot of Super Mario today, and he is a play that people are getting, I guess, worried about because of the weather in that game. LSU, Tulane, and Kansas State game. Big torrential rains and lightning potential there. So we'll see what happens. It's scaring people off. Mario Williams, I already have him at like 6% aggregated ownership, probably be even less than that. I've been asked by at least 3 or 4 people this morning in DMs if that's pushing me away. Makes sense for the Giddens play, right? If it's going to be wet, rainy, they're going to be running the football. But Williams operating out of the slot, I feel like he's still relatively safe, and he's just the best overall option. And every time I end up overreacting to weather, especially in football, I end up living to regret it later. And that player that I would have been on ends up having a huge game. So I don't want to get too scared of the weather stuff happening there. But if you are uncomfortable with that, I understand with Mario Williams, but I still will be pretty high on him. It's a player that I'm kind of drawing a line in the sand on. Knock out a few more questions here. Stribling or Raphael Williams straight up? I would say Stribling. Now, on Thursday's show, when Jake and I were talking, and just because of Underdog, like nobody was talking about Stribling. No one was drafting him on Underdog. It was all Rashad Owens, Brennan Presley. Stribling's cheap on DK, second most targeted player in last week's game. To me, he made the most sense. Now, when we look at the most updated ownership across multiple sources, he's now projecting as one of the top 5 highest owned wide receivers. So Stribling, definitely a solid play there as a main team option. I would be looking at Raphael Williams, Poppy, as he likes to be called, as a GPP look. I like his anytime touchdown prop as well. To me, and I'm getting a lot of questions about which Pittsburgh receiver to use, to me, he's the best overall option. There's upside built in. He's a cheaper price. He knows that offense very, very well with his coordinator coming over with him from Western Carolina. Kenny Johnson had the big game last week. I know a lot of people want to use him. He's perfectly fine. The talent is there. And our guy come out of Mumfield, a little more safer. I thought my mic wasn't working there for a minute. A little safer. So there's various options and different ways you can play it. If you're running multiple lineups, you'll want to dabble in exposures to all. But I will say this: Raphael Williams is going to be an absolute just fantasy stud, and I don't think he'll be below 6K past the week 4 or 5. And I do think he scores another touchdown again today. So certainly on the Raphael train, but I'm going with Stribling there. If you were to run the 2 quarterbacks, who would you run? Taylor Green, Avery Johnson. Those are kind of my top 2. Kind of on even or easy on DraftKings for me. Eli Holstein would be the other one. He's a very good play. Maybe doesn't have the rushing upside of the other 2, which we don't quite know yet. Still early in his career. Maybe he develops in that way. But if you think that Pittsburgh offense has got the juice and they're going to put up a ton of points today, Eli Holstein makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like you just messaged that you really like him. I always say trust your gut at the end of the day. If you have him ahead of Avery Johnson or Taylor Green, I would highly suggest you run him. And I would probably run a Pittsburgh receiver with him as well. I'm not as big as others on the whole stacking correlation stuff in college football because it's not as necessary, but it makes sense to run a Williams, Mumfield, or Johnson there. All right. Getting a lot of lineup picture questions. I can't really look at those when I'm on air. It's a bit difficult on my computer here, but I'll try. Getting asked about Sorsby of Cincinnati. That is one that I am certainly underweight on compared to the rest of the field, and it's not for any particular reason other than I want to see sustained, continued production from him. 8K is a pretty spendy price for Sorsby. Now, he does have the rushing upside that we've seen in the past from last year. He had the 2 rushing touchdowns last week. I do think he has the certifiable weapons to do some damage here. The running game seems like it's a bit of a mess for Cincy. I do like the pop that Evan Pryor has, but they're going to have to figure it out between Covey and Kiner and a few other guys. I do think that'll allow the defense to cheat a little bit until that running game is figured out. For me, I would use Sorsby in game stacks only. He would not be a main team play for me. At the end of the day, that may end up being a debacle, a big mistake, but I just don't think he's above the other 3 that I have as my top, which again is Avery Johnson, Taylor Green, and Eli Holstein, where I sit at the moment. All right, let's get into let me pull up the aggregated. So we're going to be we're already working on, and we're going to have projections, ownership stuff like we did in college basketball. Going to take a couple of weeks to refine those and feel very confident in those. So right now it's kind of take it with a grain of salt, but we do have some ownership projections of our own, and also what I've looked around as the industry, have some projections, all that good stuff. So let's go into, and I'll get those YouTube questions answered here in a minute, on DraftKings first. So no surprise, Ollie Gordon, one of the highest owned players on the slate. We'll start with running backs here. Ollie Gordon and DJ Giddens, the top 2 highest projected ownership. Desmond Reed, followed by LaQuint Allen, and then Jamal Haynes. Those are the 5. That combination, you'll see a lot of traditionalists run 3 of those 5 in their lineups. Someone like myself might be inclined to run 4 of those 5. And I'm being asked pretty frequently, which one of those am I dropping out? Right now, it's looking like LaQuint Allen. Now, I have a lot of Allen props. I have a lot of Allen in Underdog. I have Allen galore. He is the one that's falling out of my main lineup. Might that be a mistake? Totally could be. I have this odd feeling about Georgia Tech's defense, stepping up today. I think the ultimate deciding factor for me between him and Jamal Haynes was the fact that Syracuse just got absolutely obliterated on the ground against Ohio. Haynes just seems like a mortal lock for 100+ rushing yards. He will score, catches passes here and there, but I really feel strongly about the type of game he can have: 125 yards, 2 touchdowns, something like that, and ultimately outscore LaQuint Allen. So that's kind of the banking I'm doing. Now, right now, the lineup that I have in has Giddens, Gordon, Reed, and Jamal Haynes. And you might be side-eyeing like, wait a minute, you said you were going to play Caleb Johnson. I have a lot of Caleb Johnson lineups, and it's, I've got a little under 45 minutes. He may sneak in to the super flex. Iowa running backs. Jake's in the Discord, what are you doing? You're crazy. Not an Iowa player. He's very against using Iowa players. I get it. But it's not going to be a 0-0 game. It's not going to be a 3-0 game. Iowa's going to have success running the football. They're going to rely on their tight end and Luke Lachey. He's really cheap. Caleb Johnson's really cheap. Those guys are going to perform. They're going to produce. So right now, I'm still debating the Caleb Johnson play, and I have a little bit of time here. I'll have to make a decision, but he's a much better play than I think people realize. I have him at like 2% ownership. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. But if it ends up panning out, we would have a monster slate, similar to how it worked out last week with plays like Griffin Wilde, Bayshell Tootin. Obviously, they were higher owned than 3%, though. All right, at wide receiver, our top 5 highest owned receivers. Looking at Oronde Gadsden. Surprise, surprise. Price came up to $5K, still not high enough. Deshaun Stribling, who has come way up from what he was just a couple of days ago. I think people kind of figured out, wait a minute, this guy's target share is large. Why are we only rostering, Presley and Owens? Stribling's cheaper. It makes sense. He's going to get volume. Ty Felton, Zape, after his production last week, how could you not? I love Caden Prather this week. I think he's a great pivot off of a chalkier Felton. Prather, more of the PPR look. He's not going to be taking the top off the defense, having these huge plays, but he can rack up points quickly, similar to what we saw from Jordan Moore yesterday of Duke, in a game in which Malik Murphy didn't play particularly well, but he ended up finding more time and time again. Something similar could absolutely happen for Caden Prather today, especially against a Spartan secondary that's just no good. Then you have Xavier Henderson after his big game for Cincinnati, the clear WR1. They did spread the targets around behind him. He's a bit expensive for me, but if you do go with the double values, a cheap Luke Haas perhaps, or a Luke Lachey, perhaps you want to take the death ride with me on Caleb Johnson, you end up having over 7K for a receiver in that type of build. Henderson is perfectly fine in that spot if you don't want to blow up the rest. And then it's the last highest owned spot there. It's between Luke Lachey, the tight end for Iowa, and then Trebor Pena right behind. I thought Pena represented good pivot off of Oronde Gadsden, but it looks like there's going to be quite a few people who overlap the two, even in lineups where they don't play Kyle McCord. It can work. It worked last week as well, but I would only run Pena if you're making a conscious decision to fade Gadsden there and try to, outplay the field, hoping that he scores 8 or 9 fantasy points. Pena scores 20, something like that. That work out good for you. At quarterback, and this is DraftKings, remember, you have Taylon Green, Avery Johnson, Eli Holstein, Peyton Thorne, which may be a bit of a surprise for some of you. It was for me. I think the third, fourth, fifth quarterbacks on the slate, we're talking like 12 to 15%. I don't think there's a lot of concentration after Holstein, Avery Johnson, and Taylon Green. I think those 3 are very obvious. After that, it gets a little bit wacky. And then Riley Leonard on the cusp right after that as well. Like Billy Edwards a lot. I think he's being overlooked by the masses, but more of a GPP look. Just some concern there for me. I'm not worried about MJ Morris coming behind him and taking snaps. But if Edwards does have a bad start, perhaps that could happen. But again, against the Spartans defense, I'm not particularly worried about that situation whatsoever. All right, let's see. Damn, getting just bumped. All right. What's up? T9X78, regular of the show. Appreciate your continued support. Top QB after Green on DraftKings. For me, it's Avery Johnson, Eli Holstein right there as well. But those are the group of three that I'm looking at. If I'm running a 2-quarterback lineup, it's going to be 2 of those 3. Best wide receiver, 3,800 or less on DK from a man Day. So it's going to be a tight end, right? But I mean, obviously wide receiver, tight end, but Luke Haas at 3.3, falling into that narrative, grew up an hour outside of Stillwater. He's going to be a guy that they lean on heavily. I feel like his prop, which is around 25.5 receiving yards in a lot of books, the over in that is live. Also Luke Lachey, the tight end for Iowa. He's right there at that price point that you're talking at 3.8. So one of those two. I would prefer it to be Haas because I have so much Taylon Green, but Lachey will be the chalkier the option. But one of those two are going to be what you're looking at there for your cheap receiver / tight end exposure. All right, let's go to FanDuel. For those of you playing the FanDuel main slate, have some overall projections here for FanDuel slate. Let me get to the right spot here. All right. So again, don't take these as gospel. It's going to be hit or miss here for a couple weeks, and this is just my ownership projections here as close as I can. We will be releasing a projection sheet as well with points and ownership and stats. Like to have that by week 4 or 5 for our community. So that is coming down the pipeline. I have shown screenshots to some of the subs as kind of a preview, but like I said, I don't want to release that yet until we have it dialed in. Anyhow, on FanDuel, the top 5 highest owned quarterbacks, starting with Jalen Milroe. No surprise there. They have that extended slate all day. Bama games there. NC State, Tennessee's there. Colorado's there. Some firepower games. Taylon Green, no surprise there. Anthony Collandera, the Virginia quarterback, who has the juice. I like Collandera this year, and I like this Virginia team against Wake Forest today. Projecting as the top 5 highest owned quarterback, right around 3rd on the slate. Nico, our guy Nico, is there at 4th, and then Avery Johnson. So Taylon Green, Avery Johnson coming up a lot for me. I think the masses will have them as well on FanDuel. Jalen Milroe, Taylon Green, Anthony Collandera, Avery Johnson, and our boy Nico Maliva. Running back, Ollie Gordon. Shocker, right? Even at his astronomically high FanDuel price, much harder to get these guys in on FanDuel, but Ollie Gordon, you got to find a way. DJ Giddens, LaQuint Allen, Jamal Haynes, and then Damon Claiborne, the Wake Forest running back there, should have a lot of success against Virginia. Wide receivers on FanDuel, top 5, highest owned, KC, my man Kevin Concepcion, Chris Brazzell from Tennessee, Oronde Gadsden, that name coming up again, Malachi Fields, now that Malik Washington is in the NFL, Fields is the guy for Virginia. The fact of the matter is he had over 800 receiving yards last year, despite being the WR2. He's going to have a monster season against Richmond last week. 5 catches for 100 yards with little effort today against Wake Forest. You can expect a huge effort. I love Malachi Fields and his prop. I have hit the 100+ prop all over the place all morning. I absolutely love Malachi Fields. And then rounding out that top 5 there, Jeremiah Smith, the true frosh from Ohio State, who looked amazing last week. Looks like he might be usurping Emeka Egbuka sooner rather than later. Don't want to get too caught up in just 1 week, of course, but Jeremiah Smith is here to stay, and he's going to be a big-time factor for the Buckeyes. So that takes care of the projected ownership and what we expect. Keep throwing those questions out at me. Let me get over here. All right, people asking about bets, so we'll get into that now. Primary bets, and let's see what the current thing, at this point, we're posting, I want to throw this out there. I have 2 betting articles a week that come out. Those are free. So if you're not a sub or a member of the community, you can check those out free of charge. We also have a very active betting Discord where we post that and a betting tracker, which keeps us accountable. You can check there, to kind of see it, your favorite providers picks all in one convenient spot. So my top bets still remain, and we'll see what the lines are on them. But the featured 2 Pittsburgh money line, which surprise, surprise, against the public. Now they were +2 to start. It's not a huge deal, but they're +1.5 now. So perhaps a little bit of money coming in there on Pittsburgh. I love this retooled offense that they have. The WCU coordinator is just an absolute stud. He's got his weapons there. I'm not really trusting Cincinnati. I think there's issues in the running back room. Defensively, they're going to be okay, but Cincinnati traditionally hasn't been a team to cover at home very consistently in the post-Ritter era. So I'm taking the Pittsburgh money line straight up. All right, and the other one, man versus machine. Our model absolutely loves the under, and you know what? I'm losing with the lack of closing line value here. If my friend Rob was on, he'd say CLV, who needs it? I took the over, 60.5 in the game between Tennessee and NC State, the Duke's Mayo kickoff game taking place in Charlotte. It now sits on DraftKings at 60. Not a huge deal, but the under 60.5 is what our model loves. Personally, I'm all over the over. I just don't see it. I don't see it not hitting. Grayson McCall, well put together offense. Their running game is going to be stepping up. They have one of the best weapons in the country in Kevin Concepcion. Tennessee on the other side, Nico, all their running back, and Dylan Sampson. They have a really loaded receiver room. NC State's defense didn't look particularly great last week. They gave up some points in the game that was closer than it was expected against WCU. The Vols took care of business, but even their own beat writers and supporters of the team are a little worried about their secondary as well. They'll certainly be tested here by Grayson McCall. And in with that over 60.5 bet, I have the passing yards props for Nico 275 plus, which has changed a lot in terms of the value, and Grayson McCall 275 plus passing yards as well. Those were at plus 140 at one point. I know they've changed now. Plus 195 for Grayson McCall 275 plus, and Nico 275 plus at plus 130. I feel both of those guys are going to sail over 300 passing yards in a game that I expect to be a shootout. If it's not, if it's a defensive battle where it goes under, I'm going to be extremely disappointed, and I will bow down to the computer model there for that one, but it just seems very unlikely that this game doesn't turn into an instant classic when it comes to DFS and overall fantasy purposes. Let me get a $6,300 super flex on DraftKings. All right. There's kind of a no man's land price here between like 6.2, 7K outside of quarterbacks. It's really just a dead zone. Since it's super flex, we have some quarterback options here, but let's see. Mekhi Hughes for Tulane. Certainly an option there. Don't hate the idea of using him. I will almost always prefer a running back in the flex. I was getting a lot of questions earlier today about a wide receiver or a running back in that flex spot. I try to prioritize a running back. They're very valuable in the collegiate football game, so tend to lean that way. But I'd say Desmond Reed. I'm assuming you already have Desmond Reed, but if not, that would be your answer for the super flex spot there, my friend. All right. This is the question right here, man. This is the question. Iowa running backs. So here's the deal. Nobody's going to play Iowa outside of Luke Lachey. We're going to see, like right now, I have Lachey tentatively around 19.5%, just under 10 fantasy points. might end up seeing a higher spike in that depending on the contest in terms of ownership. We're going to see ownership on him, but the running backs people are going to look at and say, no way, Jose. Why do I think that? Because of the fact of they're going to be running multiple players. Caleb Johnson should be the guy, but we went through this last year at times with this group. Games where LaShawn Williams, he looked like he was going to be the stud. Use him, Caleb Johnson ends up going nuts. Okay, let's go ahead and try to use Caleb Johnson. It's a little reactive, but he's getting the carries. You use Caleb, suddenly LaShawn Williams goes off. Both of those guys still on the team. Williams had a fumble last week, and he ended up barely playing after the first half suspension was over for Caleb Johnson. Now, there was talk of him having a minor injury, and that's the reason why he actually didn't play. I don't fully buy that. I think a lot of it had to do with the fumble and whatever this mysterious ailment is. But if he's truly dealing with something, we'll probably see somewhat of a reduced carry load for him. And then you have the younger kid, Kamari Moulton, who actually is the co-starter today with Caleb Johnson, since Johnson's not suspended anymore. Didn't play the first half last week because of the suspension. I'm going to get to that in a minute. But as the co-starter, Kamari Moulton sitting there at 4.8. He had 19 carries last week, technically the most, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's going to get the carries this week. So Caleb Johnson did not play the first half. He still went on to rush for 119 yards in the second on just 11 carries, scored twice, had an 8-yard reception for good measure. Their offense in the first half was sputtering out. As soon as Caleb Johnson took the field in the second half, it was a wrap. And obviously they were never truly in danger of losing to a team like Illinois State, but the Redbirds did enough to keep that Iowa offense from scoring in the first very much. And it probably had more to do with Iowa themselves. But with Caleb Johnson, they just have a guy legitimately capable of running over opposing defenders. And it would not shock me if this year Caleb Johnson put together a game of 200-plus rushing yards. I'm not saying it's going to happen right now today in a rivalry game like this. It would be amazing if it did. But I feel pretty strongly about Caleb Johnson having the monster season that maybe we thought was going to happen last year, and he's productive, no doubt. So for me to rank them, it's Caleb Johnson. They're at 4.2. He's the number one option for me if I'm using an Iowa running back. Then it would be Kamari Moulton at 4.8, which I don't love that price for him. And then lastly would be LaShawn Williams at 4.5. And then you also have to throw in there the youngster Jay-Z Patterson, who also was dealing with the first half suspension last week, ended up not playing due to coach's decision in the second half, sitting there at 3.4. He's certainly not a play, but he's a guy that could potentially get some carries. So there's a bit of murkiness here in the Iowa running back room. They're also going to be unleashing Caleb Brown, who is available today and as a receiver. A lot of talent. They're very excited about him. Might they be throwing more initially? Possibly, but me, if I'm doing anything, it is the Caleb Johnson show. And like I said, I'm dangerously close to clicking him into my main. I now have just over 20 minutes to decide, and I still don't fully have that answer. Darren Gordon for one lineup in GPP or no? I don't think that there's any upside to fading Ollie Gordon this week. If we had multiple pay ups at every position, then I could get behind doing that. Whether you're running just one large field GPP lineup or one small single entry contest, I think you just got to start your lineup with Ollie Gordon. You're going to have that salary because honestly, probably not paying $9K for Ewers. There are some people paying for Riley Leonard, almost $9K. I don't know. Cam Rising, he's okay out there, right, at almost $9K. But you're probably playing one of those sub 8K quarterbacks that we've harped on. You're probably not paying up at wide receiver. You have all this salary available to you. Jaden Ott's going up against a relatively tough defense in SEC country in Auburn, and he's dealing with an injury with a game time decision label. So there's really no one else for you to pay for. There were some murmurs earlier this week about, oh my God, Ollie Gordon, his YPC was 3.9, 27 carries, should have had 180 yards. What happened? just that volume is there. I'm a big YPC guy, but when it comes to Ollie Gordon, I'll just take my 30 touches and whatever happens, happens. Last week, he was 40% owned, right? And that just killed 60% of the field. I think it's going to be flip-flop this week. I think about 40% end up fading him, 60% roster. And again, I just don't see much upside in fading him. God forbid he gets injured, but that would be the only thing that would give you a leg up if you end up fading. Ineffectiveness, I guess. But when you look at this Oklahoma State running back room, it's a bunch of younger players behind Ollie Gordon. They're not going to usurp him for any time. They'll give him, a water break here or there. But overall, Gordon's going to get those 30-plus touches. And when his coach is walking around saying his punishment is going to be 35-plus touches, you just have to keep rostering that guy. And he's going to get to a point where he's priced so high like he is on FanDuel. It's going to be tougher. Value is going to be harder to come by. But I'm going to be finding a way to get Ollie Gordon into my lineup each and every week, this week especially. Do you like the wide receiver Simmons on Auburn? Getting a lot of Auburn receiver questions, and maybe I'm approaching this one incorrectly. I'm trying not to fall for the Peyton Thorne, bonanza game that he just did. As far as receivers go for this team, they're decent looks for GPPs. I'm getting a lot of Cam Coleman questions as well. And I see you're asking about Malcolm Simmons. He's min price, had a huge game. One of his touchdowns was 57 yards last week, around 60. He's an okay GPP look. Again, I would rather play Luke Haas, who I know has guaranteed snaps on the field and volume coming his way. Luke Lachey, now they're a little bit more, 300 more and 800 more. But if you're running like a Thorne lineup, and you want to have a triple stack and some options, it could make sense to run him. I would be looking towards Rivaldo Fairweather, a tight end who only was targeted 3 times last week, 1 catch, but he was the leading receiver for this team last year. Now, the receiver room for Auburn is more talented than it was last year, but I think Fairweather is going to end up in competitive games being the one that Thorne ends up relying on more than others. And then I'm seeing a lot of chatter for Cam Coleman. Super fast, has pedigree. A lot of people are excited about him. 2 catches for 62 yards in the score last week. He had a 48-yard touchdown last week. And then you have Keandre Lambert-Smith, the Penn State transfer. So some decent options there. Simmons at 3K. Dart throw in a GPP. I don't hate the idea. Darren asks, Reed Felton or Singleton Stribling? So for me, that would be Reed Felton. Stribling is going to be a very chalky play. We're not fading Desmond Reed right now until he's priced much higher. Very comfortable with him. He wasn't even what's crazy is he put up that score last week and he wasn't even really that active. He had like 2 or 3 receptions, right? But he wasn't hugely active as a receiver because, they had all the other guys making plays and he was doing stuff on the ground. But Reed was a big-time pass catcher out of the backfield at WCU, and that aspect of his game will be unleashed. And when it does, he's going to be putting up some Ollie Gordon-like scores. So he's just not priced up high enough to get off yet. Ty Felton, it feels like a chase, but you know what? Michigan State's secondary is going to be porous, and Caden Prather and Ty Felton are going to absorb literally 80% of the targets in this offense. It's just that they don't have a marquee tight end this year. They have a little bit of depth, with Octavian Smith, but those two are going to be getting majority of the volume. Very easy to predict. Stribling, good play. Singleton, a nice GPP look, has some major home run hitting ability. We know that, but Reed Felton there is very easy. Is Felton a main team play? Yes, absolutely. He is a big-time main team play. You have the salary to go him over Caden Prather, go ahead and do it. If you need the salary savings, Caden Prather is also a main team play. Is Bernard in play at all after a bad week last week? No Utah running backs for me. Reason being is they're not going to be scoring on their 1 to 2 play drives this week. They might on one of them, but not every single one. Just have too many cooks in the kitchen. Bernard's not going to get a workload even in close games that gives him 25 plus touches. There may be games where when they ride the hot hand, he gets close to that number, but they're going to be few and far between. He's 5'8", and that's just really difficult to trust. Jalen Glover, is going to be there getting touches. They really like Mike Mitchell. He's going to continue to usurp work. And of course, I know people are enamored with John Stanley, who had the 79-yard touchdown last week, actually 3 receptions for 150 yards, 2 scores. I think his carries will start to diminish. He's a weapon, so they're going to want to use him at, when they can. But overall, there's just way too many people in this running back room for us to be using Micah Bernard on a slate with so many elite running backs. All right. Discord is exploding. Let's see here. So Penn State starting news: Harrison Wallace and Liam Clifford return as the starting wide receivers for Penn State as expected, but Julian Fleming will take over for Amari Evans in the 3rd spot. So Fleming, who couldn't end up doing much of anything in their first game, now will be starting over Amari Evans. If that is something you're interested in, there you go. Underdog news: the Battle Royale closed at 9,108 entries. That's a hell of a push. It was at like 6,000 yesterday. Reminds me of the DK bots there. Craig asks, FanDuel last guy in wide receiver at 6,300. Let me pull that up. Super Mario. I'm not scared. I'm not scared. If you can get 200 more and go Ryan Williams, you do it. But Super Mario at 6,300, or if you want to be stubborn, as I sometimes preach, as I always preach, Dorian Singer sitting there at 6-1. Victim of circumstance. I want to harp on that for a minute. Utah was having 1 to 2 scoring drives. Like their drives were literally 1 to 2 plays. 3 of them goes to Brant Kuthi, 2 goes to their RB3, RB4. It could have easily been him. Still ran the second most routes. Still tied for the most targets on the team. Dorian Singer did not forget how to play football. I do believe he returns to his form that he was playing like at Arizona. You want to be getting him early before the rest of the field realizes he's good. Buy low week at 6,100 for Dorian Singer. Absolutely love him over there on FanDuel. I don't have a lot of FanDuel action this morning. I typically like to play their later slates because they're a little bit easier for construction and people overlook cheapies. I would be playing Dorian Singer as a borderline main team play over on FanDuel for what it's worth. All right. Haynes, Mumfield, Haas, or Giddens, Stribling, Royer. Seen a lot of Royer talk, getting a lot of people interested in Royer. And I get it. He's definitely a guy who contributed at a high level for Cincinnati last week. 5 catches for 89 yards. He's 3.8, another one of those cheapy, short yardage guys. Certainly makes sense in the context of game stacks, but in a vacuum, as they say, I would prefer Luke Lachey or Luke Haas. That would just be my own interpretation there. So the trio of Haynes, Mumfield, Haas would be what I would be choosing. And that's with the idea or knowing that Giddens and Stribling are going to be extreme chalk. So fade at your own risk. 5,600 left for Superflex. Ty Felton or Katron Allen. Allen more of a GPP look. He has home run hitting ability. Ty Felton is the guy that I would be taking there over him. B-Will's asking me Jamal Haynes versus LaQuint Allen. I've been asked that one about 7 times in the last 20 minutes. I am Jamal Haynes over LaQuint Allen. That is my final answer. Caleb Johnson, Xavier Henderson, or Mekhi Hughes, Raphael Poppy Williams. Does your answer change knowing I have Reed in the lineup? Mekhi Hughes makes sense because if that game is going to be so porous because of the weather, mucked up, all that stuff. But I think Xavier Henderson, Caleb Johnson would be my lean there personally. Henderson gives you a reliable target, and Caleb Johnson I think he's going to do it today, folks. I really think he's going to do it. Thoughts on Lee from Pitt? Was heavily targeted. He also came over from West Carolina in their exodus. I don't hate the idea of using him. what do you have, 9 targets? I do think when it's all said and done, he falls behind Raphael Williams, Kanata Mumfield, and Kenny Johnson for targets. So I wouldn't be looking to roster him this week, but he's certainly, worth exposure for GPP, all type of builds. Okay, people asking about the night slate, but we're not going to have time for that. So 13 minutes to lock. There's my man Aaron dropping in. Kenny Johnson, Raphael Williams, or Haas Felton. I would go Haas Felton there. I believe when we were talking earlier, you told me you had Eli Holstein, so I get the Johnson Williams play there. With Reed, that would be a little bit too much Pittsburgh, I think, for a main lineup. So Haas Felton would be my move. Both are just guaranteed such a high amount of the targets on their respective teams. That would be my move. Landing at 5.8K flex. Don't really like anyone. Rocket Sanders maybe last man in. Now, Rocket Sanders is amazing. He is very good. And now that he's healthy, he's going to be a guy that you find us talking about a lot. Priced at only 5.2. The volume's going to be there. We saw with South Carolina last week. They're just not going to be able to throw the ball with Lenoris Sellers. They're going to be running the ball regardless. Now, he had a YPC of 3.7 on 24 carries. Didn't even break the century mark. That's tough. But at least the volume's going to be there. It is a tough matchup at Kentucky, and their defense is going to be, one of the higher end units in the SEC. So very tough to really get behind utilizing him. Maybe if that's one of those GPP alt builds that you're doing. Otherwise, that flex spot here, I think you asked me about Felton, right? So you probably already have him. If you leave some salary on the table and look for some swaps in the later games, you could go Caden Prather instead. Assuming you have Desmond Reed, you have him there. All the options that we like are the guys that we're highest on, all fall in that spot. Instead of playing Rocket Sanders, you could get a little fancy, as I just talked about Dorian Singer for FanDuel. He is 6-1 on DraftKings, and while I'm not using him there, if Singer scores today, it would not surprise me one bit. All right. I guess he's a little bit too high. We need it 5.8. Favorite 7K or less receiver on FanDuel, not named Singer or Razzle. All right, real quick. That'll be the last one, and then I'm going to get out of here to finish up lineups. All right, receiver below 7K. Brew McCoy. Would be the guy. And I actually prefer Brew McCoy over Brazzle, believe it or not. I know Brazzle's trending to be one of the higher owned receivers on the FanDuel slate, but Brew McCoy is going to be a really high-end targeted receiver, and I think he ends up being the WR1 in the Vols offense when it's all said and done. All right, that's going to do it, guys. We are 10 minutes to the slate locking. Appreciate all of 300 of you watching right now. Great show. We'll be back next Thursday, 9 p.m. PST to break down the week 3 main slate. Articles galore. And of course, NFL has already started, but the first NFL Sunday tomorrow. Get those green screens today. Pad the bankroll. Let's make those window trips so we can play around with some of that NFL money tomorrow. Best of luck to everybody out there. Let's get after it. We'll be in the Discord all day, tilting, providing plays, and willing touchdowns. Take care, guys. Love y'all. See ya.